My name is Shana McLean. I work for NASA's Earth Sciences Division, and I'm joined by my colleague, Charles Hike, who works for ImageCat. Our session today is on a call to action for resilience, where we hope to move from research to practice. Let's move to the next slide, please. What I'm going to do today is just walk you really briefly through our agenda, what we hope to accomplish, and then we'll move directly into the presentations. So specifically what we're hoping to do is talk in depth about the role that Earth observation data can play in really building resilience. There are a lot of opportunities there, but there are a lot of challenges that exist in moving this work from research to practice. And so Charlie will be our first presenter talking about this. And then we will move from Charlie into our three invited speakers who will present their perspectives and their unique views from the sectors that they represent on the future of risk analysis and resilience. After that, we'd like to hear from all of you on your perspectives, and so we'll invite you to move into specific breakout sessions or rooms that allow us to learn more about you and your thoughts on what we've been presenting today. And then finally, we didn't call this a call to action just to have a snappy title. We're really hoping to use this session as a first step in a series of actions toward building momentum and sustained action on this topic. And so part of what we're hoping to do and get out of the session is, after learning from our speakers and from all of you, we have been invited to submit an article into a special edition of the Journal of Sustainability. And the goal is to take what we've learned and really write up essentially a manifesto or a call to action that can sustain the efforts that we're talking about today. And so without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie Hike, who will start to really frame the perspective we're talking about. Charlie, over to you.
Thanks, Marina. So hopefully everybody here that's joined has a little bit of optimism about how EO can potentially be used to bolster resilience throughout the disaster cycle. There's a lot of challenges, obviously, and Shana will get to those a little bit later. We wrote up a nice list, and hopefully we can all brainstorm about how to address some of these. But to start off, I'd like to present kind of a glass half full perspective of how I think that EO can be used to address resilience. Next slide, please, Marina. Okay, so the first and perhaps most obvious way is during the response phase. Just right off the bat, situational awareness. This is sort of, by situational awareness, I mean sort of a boots on the ground perspective, people having imagery in hand, being able to use it to make decisions like where should we set up tents, where should we serve food, where is the landslide, where's this damage, where's the damaged hotel that we need to look for search and rescue. You can think there's thousands of decisions after an event that need to be made, and imagery really helps not only excuse me, make those decisions, but offer a common operating framework for people to have these types of conversations. More interestingly, perhaps, that was just the first point. More interestingly, perhaps, the damage detection, loss estimation, being able to interpret imagery to look at the extent of the damage manifest on the ground, things like surge, inundation area, building damage, and so forth. That, if appropriately done, leads to deployment of aid and disaster declarations and the like. Next slide, Maria. Next, for risk assessment, you've got EO data used for exposure, vulnerability, and delineation of the hazard. This is work that we do a lot of at ImageCat, working with Bob and for the NASA Disasters Program, which Shana is a part of there. You can see where buildings and infrastructure are in EO data. You might not be able to see the details of building construction, but you can use sampling strategies and so forth to develop these types of building exposure databases. This is one is from the Meteor Project, where we did 46 countries, developing countries, And you can cross-reference this with hazard data to get a portrait of risk. Next slide. Next, looking at the hazard, as a disaster unfolds, you can see the extent of flood, wildfire, the direction of hurricanes, tornado scarps. But I think more and more, we're going to be in a situation where we can go back in the historical record and start to extract incidences of hail and tornado, for example, that weren't recorded, and get a better portrait of probabilistic hazard. And this is work that's also being investigated at NASA. Next slide. Vulnerability, this one's a little trickier. Some of the structural engineers in the audience might be a little dubious, but particularly where damage is more binary. You can see where you've got, for example, damage from a storm surge, tsunamis, wildfires, and be able to track, sort of the percent damage within those areas of impact. And also even in cases where you go out and do surveys. Survey teams aren't usually very good at characterizing the denominator. They might tell you how many buildings there were that were damaged, but not out of how many. So you can go back and check that with vulnerability, or you can just do the damage detection and then develop damage functions right off the bat if you've got good hazard data to tie it to. And lastly, during the recovery phase, you can use imagery just right out of Google Earth if you want to track how long it takes places to recover. Restoration functions are very important for characterizing things like economic impact. You can go back through and track restoration, compliance, and so forth, as well as make decisions as to whether or not you need to deploy additional aid. But there are a lot of challenges. So back over to you, Shana.
Thank you very much, Charlie. So I think, as it's mentioned in our title, we're really trying to get from this idea of research to practice. And a lot of the perspectives that I would be sharing is about what I've learned, I think, in working for NASA and also working previously with UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which is that oftentimes there's a disconnect between what we can do from an Earth observation perspective and the decisions that we're hoping to actually impact or support with the science that we have available. And a lot of the challenges that I see, I think, are just in the way that we approach them. A lot of our projects are very short-term, localized, or they're treated as a research endeavor that doesn't necessarily translate to government practice. It also means that if it's not translating to this longer term effort, that it's not becoming institutionalized and moving beyond a project into longer term programming, which then has the necessary capacities and financial stabilities that carry things forward into the longer term. We still see, despite how much we talk about this, a lot of efforts that are quite siloed. And so when we're talking about resilience, we need to look at integrated systems, and yet we're still separating issues from water, disasters, food security, and treating like these elements like their individual efforts. Despite all of these challenges, I think that there is a way forward. And so I'd like to turn now to the three invited speakers that we have who will present their perspectives on this effort. Our first speaker will be Dr. Bob Chen, who is the Director of Season at Columbia University's Earth Institute. After Bob, we will hear from Jenty Kirschwood, who is the head of Global Risk Analysis and Reporting for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And last but not least, we'll hear from Sahar Safi, who is the founder of Sage on Earth Consulting. So let's turn it over to Bob. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Shanna. And Charlie, I'm glad to be able to participate in this discussion. Some of you know I have worked in a number of related fields, so it's kind of an interesting opportunity to cut across those and try to address at least one aspect of what you raised, which is the issue of keeping data and methods close to your chest, I think was the phrase I just saw. So I'm going to talk about open data sharing across the data disaster lifecycle, and kind of bring together at least some of my experience in working across a number of communities. Next. You know, I think I see people from the audience who are from the Earth observation community, the development community, and other related ones. And everybody has their own perspective about data sharing and its role in addressing things like hazards. So I'd like to go back and just say, you know, first off, you know, it's a basic human right as recognized in the Universal Declaration that everyone should be able to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And I think it's kind of obvious that Earth observations are definitely a major scientific advancement. So next. And certainly in the remote sensing community, everyone has recognized that at least in the last 20 years, there's been this overall framework for sharing data primarily after disasters. So the charter was set up in 2000. There are 17 space agency members and other partners, a fair amount of satellites that provide data under activations. There have been, you know, over 600 activations. Data's free, but there's actually this concept of universal access, which allows many different national disaster management authorities to request data, but it doesn't mean the data is fully open and accessible. Next. Again, it's focused on crisis. It does refer to reconstruction and subsequent operations. But really, I think the primary focus has been on emergency response. Next. I know I have to go through these quickly. So within the broader Earth observation community, most of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the group on Earth observations, which had a set of data sharing principles established in 2005. They were updated in 2015 to kind of build on what was happening internationally, which is this concept of open data by default. Next. And then coming from the development community is you know, the agreement in 2015 for the 2030 agenda, which does talk about, first off, the need to leave no one behind and to have high quality disaggregated data on many dimensions, and you know, made specific reference to Earth observation and geospatial information and the need to make that more accessible. Next. So what I want to spend a little more time on is really, from my perspective, how we can strengthen Earth observation use, again, not just in the immediate response phase, but through thinking about preparedness, thinking about recovery and mitigation. And again, I don't have time to dig into it. I hope we can discuss it in the groups. But the idea that Earth observation really helps do things like what I work on, which is help improve detection of population and settlements and infrastructure, look at the consequences and the side effects of disasters and extreme events, but also thinking about how governments planned reconstruction or rebuilding or vaccination campaigns after a big pandemic. You know, these are opportunities, I think, where open data sharing is really critical. You know, I remember cases after the Indonesian tsunami where people would distribute data after the crisis because it was important to save lives after a crisis, but then they would ask for the data back, or they would start charging for data during the reconstruction phase, where we know as disaster professionals, often the biggest mortality occurs because people don't have access to clean water and are affected by disease after the immediate crisis. And that's when data is still very important, but the charter and other arrangements didn't extend to that type of period. Next. So again, we're thinking about why open data sharing is critical. We clearly need open data sharing for common understanding of impacts, for building trust among the parties and sharing information, allowing people to really reuse the data and not have restrictions on the value-added products or the products they deliver to end users, and to use data very flexibly and in combination with other data. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that was close enough to 5 minutes. Thanks.
All right, Janti, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks very much to Chuck and Shana for inviting UNDRR today. And I wanted to actually not have a PowerPoint. I figured people might be overloaded with information by the end of the day. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some experience and some observations of more than 20 years experience working in humanitarian operations, but also embedded in governments, trying to make decisions with all of the information that's out there. And over the years, my career has stretched from the Horn of Africa, through the Balkans, through Asia, Vietnam, Kyrgyzstan, and now I'm in the beautiful spot of Geneva, still trying to figure out all of those issues about how we use data well. And I guess the first point I wanted to make is that countries want information for decision-making, not more maps. And that one map isn't going to make everybody happy. There need to be agile products that can be adapted to the questions of the day, not the other way around. And so that Earth observation data that shows hazard trends is great, but it's far more useful when it's linked to vulnerability and exposure data, and particularly to the questions, whether it's COVID, whether it's a particular flood event or an earthquake, that governments and users need to answer today. One of the other things that I notice is that more and more, it's also essential that that data connects across systems. What I mean by that is it's particularly useful if you can link data across systems, because then you get new insights. You don't just better visualize what kind of everyone knew. So for example, in Vietnam, I worked with UN agencies and the government to basically overlay typhoon tracks over hazard risk maps. Now that you all know, you've all seen it, but that data came to life when we added layers on things like poverty rates, housing quality, cropping patterns, including how many weeks to harvest, was that rice highly vulnerable or not? And then, even though a lot of that overlaid data wasn't necessarily perfect, it became a rough but an honest tool for essentially forecasting the potential humanitarian hotspots that were going to be created by a typhoon 3 or 4 days in advance. It wasn't perfect, but it was usable, and because it was able to combine that data and work across some of our traditional systems and silos, it suddenly had a much higher impact than just the pure satellite data. The second point I wanted to get across is that the design process has to be iterative. It has to be tested and retested and adapted. Don't try to train people in the use of your tool. Design your tool so that users can play with it, they co-design it with you, and they tell you how to make it better. And this is where even sometimes spending time on the really small stuff, like the color coding, the presentation, is what actually can turn data into information. I worked on another project where we aimed to forecast malaria outbreaks based on Earth observation data of water availability, both in real time and in the climate future. And what was really interesting was that in that data, and with our crops reference group of end users, sometimes it was the smallest things like the color coding or the way a unit was phrased that created the aha moments where, often these bureaucrats who were sitting there wondering why on earth they should care about satellite maps, suddenly were like, oh, I need to send this to my friend, right? And in that sense also, it's important to look at things like, how can you triangulate your results? How could you get young people with smartphones to tell you whether or not this is actually true? Are there things that you can do to create trust in your users so that people will really get the information that they want, but they'll also be inspired to use it? And the last point, I think, picks up on something that Bob hit on in his presentation, but it is the elephant in the room in some ways, which is that many smart countries don't want to be dependent on foreign experts, and they don't want to pay for data that they help generate. And there is a lot of sensitivity. I've worked in many conflict zones or post-conflict zones. People don't want to hand over raw data. And I think in that sense, and think about if the tables were turned, would your boss let you send raw data from your institute over with no questions asked? So sometimes I think we need to look at the questions that we're, or the options that we're giving other countries, but we also need to look at how we can co-design with partners, with local institutions, have more processing done in country to remove sensitivity about data sharing, and at the same time look at different types of partnerships so that the end products are really owned by, you know, all partners. In that sense, I think it's also important in my experience to make sure that the team you're working with is going to be around for a while, and that works about on both ways. Sometimes flying someone in just once or twice for a workshop seldom really builds capacity, although it can be super good in building interest. And so when we're looking at what our call for action would look like, I'd be interested to also see, you know, is there a way of having a dedicated network of experts who could undergo regular training and be utilized on need? The UNFCCC FCCC is using it for global greenhouse experts. Maybe there's some models there in building capacities in different ways that we can explore in this group. So just to sum up, I think I've worked as a user of these products for the best part of 2 decades. And while the technology has improved dramatically, almost unrecognizably, the old questions of data sharing interoperability are still the same. But also, Earth observation data is utterly essential to DRR and DRM, and we simply can't have sustainable development in a truly sustainable sense without it. So looking for those win-win solutions is key, but also putting a focus on getting funding to get base information up to scale, and then allowing smaller actors, local institutions to use that base information to create the whistles and bells that chime to specific users' needs might be an interesting way to look at this issue. The more bottom-up pilots that can't grow, the more investment isn't maybe the most effective way of building a network. But if we can get people to evolve and grow the system over time on a stronger base, then we've really got a network that I think can be incredibly helpful, not only to the DRR community, but also the climate change community. And I think this is a beautiful moment with political momentum around things like an integrated green COVID recovery and Paris achievement to really make that happen. So those are my thoughts for today, and thanks a lot for the opportunity. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Genti. So Sahar, now over to you, please.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Shana and Charlie, for inviting me to join the panel. And Genti, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your statements, and I'll just build on that. This topic is very close to my heart, and for many years it has been basically the focus of my attention at my career, working at many different institutions with many different partners, always at one side having the risk modelers and researchers as my collaborators and partners, and still doing the same since 3 years ago that I moved here to Vancouver, working with Government of Canada, mostly Natural Resources Canada, and their partners at provincial and municipal level. In fact, we even chose with the partners, at the time I was working at UNDRR, with the partners we decided to make the focus of the Sendai session on risk assessment and to be on the challenge of using risk information. Many of the partners, speakers, and contributors to that session are part of the UR community and might be in the audience. When I hear that title, which again, like I truly believe in it, but immediately I think about, we need to unpack that. We need to really understand even what we mean by resilience, which I think in this case is quite clear, disaster and climate resilience, but we need to really think, who is the target of this call? And what are the barriers and challenges we want to tackle? Without really understanding the barriers and challenges, we cannot even identify who the call is for, who are the actors, let alone identifying the actions. And even though disaster risk and disaster risk management is a very systemic and complex issue, but I think for this unpacking exercise, it's helpful to think of risk information going all the way to the use for building resilience as a supply chain. Starting with production of risk data and information, which even within that sphere, there is a supply chain of input data, modeling, output data. And then from there, the output goes into risk information communication. And then the efforts, wide range of efforts that need to happen to use that risk information for decision-making, for designing policy and plans that leads into resilience. Those three questions of who, what, and how are relevant to every one of these, and the answers are going to be different. There are different actors in these different spheres. And sometimes we kind of we don't spend the time to distinguish who is doing what and who needs to talk to who and who is empowered to take what kind of an action. So we have more of the scientists, researchers, and modelers on the production side, but we have planners, emergency managers, elected officials, land use planners, risk financing management managers, asset managers on the right side. Hopefully that's the same on your screen, of using risk information. Very quickly, some of the high-level challenges, as I said, for many years, from the time I was working internationally to now that mostly I'm working locally, I have been thinking and identifying the challenges, listening and looking at good stories and success stories and failure stories, and have identified a set of challenges that originally came from the observations internationally in developing countries and advanced countries, but they have been refined here in BC. These are the ones that have resonated very well with our stakeholders, with our community of practice here in British Columbia. Here's a list. Inefficient data sharing and data management, which both Bob and Gentil also mentioned. It's a burden on conducting hazard and risk assessment. It has an impact on the price of these kind of the risk assessments also. There are major gaps at local level in information type and resolution to be useful for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. The produced information, this one is my favorite, doesn't give the insights on the drivers of risk, on the sources of risk, on the what has contributed to risk. So that, and also it doesn't provide evidence of risk reduction opportunity. These are two sets of information that are very important for identifying solutions, risk reduction policies, programs, and projects. There are no political, economic, and regulatory incentives for using risk information. Even here in BC, we don't have the legislation that requires use of hazard information for land use planning. Information is not communicated effectively to non-technical stakeholders, and there is insufficient capacity among practitioners and decision makers in understanding and using risk information. After identifying the challenges, the question is, okay, well, what are the solutions? And one thing that by now I truly believe in, and over, by listening to the stories and experiencing different projects, it gets reaffirmed that there is no silver bullet solution. And I think sometimes the science and technology community is after that, push the button, map, give the solution kind of a tool. And I truly believe in this context, science and technology, which is advancing with rapid speed, is empowering, is facilitating, but without connection between people, we are not going to get to a solution. So I think the solution comes out of interaction between the people who have objectives, who have functions that have to play, who have a role who have to play, are managing, are a land use planner, have to design a new policy, have to update a new legislation. These people interacting with the hazard and risk information and functioning within the governance mechanism that they have. From legislations, role and responsibilities, interactions between entities, that's where the solutions come out. But this means the solutions take time. It requires people of different mindsets, different language, talking to each other, spending time, building capacity. And I think we do need to invest and accept that risk assessment has to happen throughout the process. They are means that they bring people together to understand risk. They're not processes that produce information and deliver it to their door without that interaction between people and information. This also means the solutions are different depending on the context, depending on the place, depending on type of risk, the governance and type of people you're dealing with. Here in BC, we are going after more of a holistic approach with the support of the government, with the support of a lot of partners. We believe as a community, we have reached a point that we can set up a science policy collaborative and tackle many aspects of this challenge together by building on capacities and resources of different partners. And if I wanted to give few high-level recommendations for the international community that are mandated to support the developing countries, this would be the list. With clarity on the objective, really knowing why you're producing that hazard and risk information or Earth observation data, having that clarity, with that clarity, facilitating dynamic dialogue and collaboration and co-design of tools and projects by multidisciplinary teams. Support national entities to enhance their own national rich data governance. The issue of trust that Genty also pointed out is a major issue for using risk information in developing countries. They need to own the data. Support the national and subnational science and policy stakeholders in adopting a diagnostic approach to identify sources of risk and risk reduction opportunities. Not only providing risk information, risk levels, but being able to respond why this has happened, what is contributing, and be able to answer the now what question. What are the options? What are the priority options for reducing this risk? Mobilize global and regional expertise and resources so that strategically we close the gap in hazard and risk data relevant in DRR at local level. There's still major gaps, especially at local level in developing countries, even in advanced countries, for doing effective risk reduction, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. Thank you so much. I hope that was close to 5 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sahar. Thank you also to Genty and to Bob. Incredible points. I think Charlie and I are writing to each other, telling us how thrilled we are with all of your input. It's well understood and definitely heard. I think we've got a very clear dissonance between the spirit of wanting to make data available and open and available for societal benefits, but also seeing that, to your point, Sahar, that solutions take time, and that really some of these components about interoperability that Genty mentioned are still lagging behind all the technology and data availability that we have. So what we'd like to do now, and just as a reminder to any of those who joined a little late, is that we've heard from the speakers about what their perspectives are on this. And so now we'd like to invite you to move into breakout rooms to discuss this with our speakers and share your perspectives on these topics. So this again is going to help us build what we consider to be a call to action or sustained momentum on this area. So I'm going to turn it now over to our colleague Marina, who's going to give us a little bit of the rules of what's going to happen to us over the next minute. And I will just say that I think everyone's aware these sessions are recorded, but for the sake of getting everybody to share openly, we won't be recording the breakout sessions. So please do speak candidly. We look forward to hearing from you. Marina, over to you.
Yes, hi. Just to tell you, give us just 1 minute to set up these breakout sessions, and then you will see a join button that will pop up in your window. Click in there and that will take you to the session, okay? So just stay tuned for a minute, thanks. Please join a breakout room if you want to participate. You should find the join button on your screen.
Effective in addressing these issues. It'd be nice if you could share them like you did, Patricia. That's great, because we will have limited time. Iker, at least on my screen, you appear to be next.
Yes, thanks, Charles. I'm Iker. I'm from Micro, which is a very small, 7 people strong technical assistance firm doing index-based insurance. And I really like these sessions and understanding risk in general, because it reminds me constantly that we might be focusing only in our piece of the puzzle in many occasions, and it's all the risk management process that needs to be looked at. At least I think that
design policies. So I think the biggest challenge that there is the lack of capacity. People with critical knowledge and background to take some of this information and actually put these to action. So there are good universities, technical people, but there's definitely some or not some, I would say, major gaps in where Earth observation based data, how it's derived, how it is used to used in modeling, in taking vulnerability, the hazard information and combining it into risk models, and how those outputs can be applied in informing policy decisions. So I think that there is definitely an interest, but the lack in terms of people who are in government, to work with, international, consultants such as ourselves who are going in and trying to provide that information and utilizing it, meaningfully and making policy decision. I think that's what we are facing, in some of these small island states. There is definitely a big gap in the capacity of utilizing some of the information that's coming out of these projects.
Other thoughts? I think we have people from both the public and the private sector on this. I'm interested in sort of those different perspectives on Earth observations data, which is now a combination of, public and private sources.
Yeah, see, I would like to, kind of make some observations, because I was personally involved in 2001 Bhuj earthquake in India, where more than 40,000 people died. So those days, the no models and no decision. Even the emergency operation centers were non-existent. India did not have even a DM policy. Forget that state, So Gujarat was the first state to come out with a disaster management policy after 2001 earthquake. And I remember how we made use of EO data after earthquake. We got in touch with the Indian Space Research Organization and told them if they can provide some imagery of the destruction. And I remember some scientists from ISRO used to bring those maps, and we used to sit with the chief minister and he used to explain.
Science policy gap in terms of disaster planning and management. Converting it into practice.
I can start first with Bob. Do you have one or two key points from your session that you'd like to share?
Boy, that was a really short time. So I think the limited input we were able to get, I think, focused on capacity building issues in different countries. Having resilience comes from local people having the tools and the data that they need to respond across, both after a disaster and in other parts of the life disaster cycle. So, I think it certainly comes to the issue of bringing the data in. We didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I think the emerging differences in sources of Earth observation data from the private sector as well as the public sector, and the different roles of people who are using data from the public and private sector is a key issue in terms of how to share and how to develop capacity that helps everyone.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bob. Agreed that it was quite short time. Maybe we can ask Sahar for a couple points, and then Genti, and then I'll give a few points and we can close.
Sure.
Sahar?
The time was very short, but we still did get 5-6 points, which I know I don't have time to talk about it right now. But if I want to pick and choose, one was again emphasize emphasizing on the fact that even between production of data, before even getting to communication, some extensive, elaborate and thoughtful analysis of data is needed to extract and format the outputs in an understandable, usable format for the users relating to the context of those users. We also heard about the issue of data trust and the issue of uncertainty and trying to communicate that to the lowest common denominator capacity in a sense, but also the challenges that raise from communicating the level of uncertainty. I think I'll pause there. We do have more items, but.
Excellent. Well, you can share them with us and
Yes,
we'll bring
sure.
them all together. Thank you, Sahar. And Jenty, over to you.
So let me jump in with just a couple of additional points, building on the ones before, from actually a surprisingly rich conversation in a very short time. A couple of points came out about the issues about pooling and not pooling of risk, because two speakers talked about having too much data, and that actually there were almost starting to be ethical issues emerging about the ability to micro-target, particularly in things like the private sector insurance, that the data was getting so good that the concept of risk pooling was becoming less relevant in terms of profit margins, which I thought was a fascinating point. There was also points about, on the good side, that there were opportunities of more public-private partnerships, and there was a new interest in that, particularly because of some of these uninsurable climate change related and other risks. And I thought that was an interesting opportunity for action. Others talked about the need for more focusing, but also that in some countries, there's still a focus too much on hazard data rather than thinking about vulnerability. And of course, some of those core issues about how do you get information so that it's used and understandable, particularly in the last mile. Over to you, Shanna.
Thank you so much. So I would just like to say thank you so much to everyone for your participation in this. Our session revealed many of the same points that all of you have shared, but just essentially like how to get better at sharing across systems, how to get out of our comfort zone, how to come together and really talk about the issues and move them forward. And I think just talking about them certainly presents us with our initial opportunity. So I think we achieved our first step. The next step would be to use this momentum and build on it and sustain the conversation moving forward. So thanks to everyone for their participation. Thank you to our speakers. This has been excellent. We've really enjoyed it. Charlie, I guess any last words from you?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say another thing that came out of our session is just what a great job that our presenters did. Really, there was so much just to even follow up on those ideas and to connect them to their stories, and really we're on target. And I think that will prepare us well for our manifesto here for us to draft up, Shanna. Thanks everybody for participating.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for the great session. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thanks, everyone.